Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. I'd like to introduce myself and welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on pandemic pedagogy, improving online transition to negotiation and conflict resolution education. This webinar is one in a series of webinars addressing topics aligned with the School of Professional Studies Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. My name is Dominic Rinaldi, and I am a Senior Admissions Counselor in the School of Professional Studies, and I'll be hosting today's session. If you are able to hear me, please type yes in the Q&A box located in the list of controls at the bottom or top of your screen. I want to make sure we can all hear our presenters loud and clear for today before we dive in. Fantastic, I'm seeing a lot of yeses come on into the Q&A box. I encourage you all to utilize the Q&A function as you develop questions during today's presentation. At the end of the session, we will be addressing some of the questions you have for our presenters. And we will not be using the chat box function for this webinar, so please direct any questions via the Q&A box function. I would also like to share that we will be recording today's session and we'll be happily sharing it to those who have registered to the session after it has concluded. At this time, I would like to welcome today's presenters. Joining us today is Dr. Beth Fisher-Yoshida, Academic Director for the MS in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program. Along with Dr. Fisher-Yoshida, we have Noam Ebner, Professor of Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at Creighton University. I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Beth Fisher-Yoshida. Hello, Beth. How are you today?
Hi, Dom. Fine. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just want to say a few words before we have Noam present his wonderful set of slides and information on pedagogy of how to really work online well in terms of a learning environment. So some of us are already familiar with online learning. Some of us are familiar with remote learning, and there are differences between the two. I'm not going to get technical now about them. And some of us are not. And so suddenly we've been thrust into a situation where we have to figure out how to create learning environments that are conducive for remote or online learning. And some of us are students figuring out how can we learn best in remote or online learning situations. And of course, that means with lots of other things happening in our lives, lots of other dynamics that are taking place, which do influence and impact our ability to learn, our ability to concentrate, and our ability to adapt ourselves to this different learning environment. And for us, it's really relevant here because we're really looking at what does it mean, especially with experiential learning in the fields of negotiation and conflict resolution. And so I know Noam has so much expertise in this area. I thought, wow, that would be great to invite him onto the webinar for the NECR program at Columbia University. And so now what I'm going to do is turn it over to Noam. He'll be speaking for roughly 30 minutes, presenting his slides. Then we'll have a few minutes of conversation, and then we will open it up to interacting with you and the questions that you will put into the Q&A box. So for no further ado, I will turn it over to Noam. Noam, please take it away.
Taking it. Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dom, for setting this up, making sure we all arrived here and everything is working. Beth, thank you so much for inviting me. And I really want to thank everybody who's attending. I know that time is both in abundance and terribly scarce nowadays, as is attention. I appreciate your being here, and I hope that our time together is spent fruitfully. As Beth said, I'll be speaking for about half an hour, but I really hope that afterwards and along the way, if you can type your comments, your suggestions, and your questions into the Q&A box and we can discuss them later. This is an area I've been working in for the past 10, 12 years, but it is one in which there is so much knowledge to be shared. I certainly don't claim to have all of it. And nobody can claim to have all the knowledge necessary to address this sudden situation that we suddenly find ourselves in nowadays. And with that in mind, let's talk about what we will be talking about today. I'll share where I'm coming from, and then we'll basically run a past, present, future spectrum on this, trying to see where we've come from as we moved from our classrooms to teaching and learning remotely, the trends that typified universities and teachers' moves in this transition, the assumptions that held true, some of the assumptions that backfired on how all this would work, and then get to the main part of our conversation today, which is what can we do to make it better? What can online education, by which, as Beth started to say, by which I mean the online education that preceded all of this, the field of online education that preceded this transition to remote teaching and learning. We've been doing this for a while. What can we do to help teachers and students who are just getting used to this and just starting to function in this world? What can we do to make that easier and also better? As Don introduced me, I teach at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. In 2006, Creighton set up a program, a master's program in negotiation and conflict resolution. I won't say similar or dissimilar, but along the lines, I would say, of the one at Columbia. And very quickly realized that as opposed to New York City, Omaha was somewhat less of a draw for traditional students or adult students to move to Omaha. But a lot of people were asking about online learning. So a couple of years later, they decided to set up an online master's program, and I was invited to come and help set that up. And eventually I became chair of that, of the online graduate program. So I've been working in graduate education in this field online since then, and before it, both online and in classrooms. And about 4 or 5 years, I started trying to spread the word, or really trying to spread basic information about online teaching to help people transition online, because looking ahead to the future, not to the future of today, because I can't claim to have expected that this would hit, but I did expect that something would hit. So I went around and at several conferences. I remember one American Bar Association conference and one IACN, International Association of Conflict Management conference, giving large sessions on online teaching and telling people that the reason that they need to know this stuff is because they will either volunteer to teach online or they would teach online kicking and screaming and dragged by their dean. And this is where we all are now, and that's exactly what has happened over the course of the past month. Only we were kicked by reality, and there was less screaming in the sense that teachers really, we'll talk about that in a second, but teachers really did their best to rise to the challenge in a very admirable way, and students rose to the challenge in an admirable way. And what they did is they transitioned to what I'm calling the difference between online education and all of these other names, as we've mentioned. So whether it's remote learning or remote teaching, emergency instruction, pandemic pedagogy, video transition courses, or all of these names, in order to distinguish it from online, let's call it intentionally online education, which is the type of learning offered in Creighton's NCR program or in Columbia's NECR program. And what happened is sometime in mid-March, depending on when you exactly received that email from your dean or department head, you received a letter saying that in X time you will be teaching online, or your courses, you will be studying your courses online. And this transition was so rapid, I simply can't remember anything like it in higher education and in a great many other fields. As one teacher put it recently, it took the university less time to make that decision than it usually takes us to arrange a faculty meeting. And I thought that really captured the swift transition. And that had different outcomes. Some of those outcomes were really, really good because it provided continuity, and some of that backfired, and we'll mention a couple of backfires later. Some of you may have received 2 or 3 weeks notice to get yourself set up, and others received less notice. In one memorable place that I know of, received 2 hours notice, and that was actually a conflict program. Received 2 hours notice, like tomorrow we're not going to have the first period. but the second period is online. So a lot of teachers did not sleep during March. And really, most of them not only rose to the challenge, but went above and beyond and did a marvelous job. And they did this mainly while students were either going home or staying home from spring break, and also trying to get themselves set up for this new reality they were going to face in a few days. Meanwhile, institutions, some handled this better than others. Generally speaking, institutions addressed students, I think, more than they addressed faculty. Sometimes they gave students so much attention that there were conflicting messages, and some of this was confusing. But mainly what they did is they tried to give information to students, and very often they told the faculty, look, you're going online, do it well, we're sure you'll be able to do it. So some teachers had more support than others in doing this. And when there was institutional support, most of the institutional support focused on technology, such as we're gonna have an hour teaching you how to use Zoom or how to use the program, the university's learning management system. And there was less focus on pedagogy. And that seemed to be okay because institutions didn't really intend for teachers to change their pedagogy in any significant way. The idea was to get courses online fast and a reasonable facsimile of the course that had been given, mainly using the same syllabus with adjustments. And that is essentially what happened in 9 out of 10 universities. Classrooms were copied and pasted online. So whether we're talking about the large lecture hall classrooms, or whether we're talking about the smaller, more small group work and experiential learning focused classrooms of negotiation and conflict resolution education, the idea was, let's take whatever the class hours were a month ago, we're going to have class during those class hours. It will be held via video. It will be synchronous. Everybody will be live and online at the same time. It will be happening in real time in those class hours. So copy and paste your traditional course, copy, paste, and do it at a distance. Behind that, I'll just say, just one last comment is that some schools did encourage teachers to think about what they might change in order to make these classes better, or what they might change in order to support students better, or to adjust their teaching to the online environment. These are mainly institutions that had a backbone of online learning. In other words, they had experience, they had IT, not only IT departments, but online learning departments that could give this pedagogical support as opposed to technical support to teachers. So there was some difference here, but so one big difference was between institutions that had experience with online teaching and learning and institutions and schools that had not gone that route before, so they didn't have either the person power or the know-how or the culture in order to do that. The assumptions behind copying and pasting courses online was that fundamentally, what we're talking about here is a geographical change. Students are no longer co-located together on campus and in the classroom. Instead, they are dispersed. Students are engaging from their homes or wherever they are, and teachers are also engaging from their homes or wherever they are. But other than geography, nothing has or will fundamentally change. The class hours will remain the class hours. There's no fundamental difference either on the teacher side or the student side. There's not much change other than geography. This turned out to be problematic assumptions. And here I'm zooming out to talk about institutions in general, and not only conflict resolution or negotiation programs, but it certainly holds true for all traditional face-to-face in-person learning across the United States and around the world from every report I've heard. That when you look at what happened in reality, what is the reality that students are facing now? So all of a sudden, do we have internet? Do we have computer access? What happens if our computer breaks down and the computer repair shops aren't functioning anymore? If a teacher tells me to print out a test and then take it in front of a video camera where they can watch me, do I have a printer? And more generally, do I have a quiet area to study in? Do I have the privacy that I need, or that I need to study or that I need to provide to the class? And I feel like, can I participate on video without my brothers, sisters, or parents, or anyone else walking in and out of the camera? And that's about access and resources. That's before taking into account that people might not be the same people that they were a week ago. They might be sick. People might have relatives who got sick and they need to take care of them. Even if they don't, students might be anxious about themselves or relatives getting sick. And again, that's before the second and third waves of what this pandemic has brought upon us hit. And those second and third waves of financial burdens, people getting laid off, people had jobs on campus or around campus and suddenly they don't have it. Jobs are scarce. Jobs were scarce and are very scarce now. Some people are essential workers and have very little freedom over their, are they going to work, are they not? Are they going to be called in or not? Many people are now taking second jobs, either replacing their previous jobs so they need to change their hours, or they're taking second jobs because of the new financial reality. And finally, this didn't just hit one student or one program or one university. Everybody across the United States is now studying at home. So if you had children, they're all homeschooling now. And either they require you to help them homeschool, or they require computers, they require internet, they require attention. And if it's not, if students don't have children, they might have siblings. And of course, everything that's true about students holds true for teachers. Who also suffer from all this. So instead, what we have is a lot of people making do, and sometimes that making do means often that students, either because of preference, due to preference, or just because that's all they have, students are participating on mobile devices more than they are on computers, which was a trend that was going on in online education even before all this hit. People are finding it very difficult to stick with class hours. People are finding it very difficult to show themselves on video because of what's going on in their background. It's not on this, but it's a main topic. Part of the reality is students with disabilities can be accommodated in traditional classrooms in certain ways. And there are other ways to accommodate students with disabilities online, but they are not the same ways. And this sudden jump left disability offices really unprepared to help students study online. And there are some students who simply cannot study online. So this is the reality that has hit us. And I facetiously asked who could have seen this coming. And I think that that's part of the problem with the decision being made so quickly, so rapidly. And I have two items under this categories. The first, Beth said when she was setting this with me, she said you could even put in a little Star Wars because I'm in the middle of editing a book on Star Wars and conflict resolution. So the first item I want to put here is the Wookiee. Those of you who recognize the scene in which it's the medal receiving scene after Luke Skywalker has blown up the Death Star, Han Solo rescued him in the Millennium Falcon. They both get medals, and for some reason, Chewbacca, the Wookiee, doesn't receive a medal. Even though he flew exactly the same mission, sitting in the seat next to Han Solo, he doesn't receive a medal. So this is just an example of the inequalities that universities suddenly realize exist between students. That these assumptions that students will be fine, that they'll be fine financially, that they're just at home and studying, and not thinking that some students' home is very supportive and very well set up for them sitting down in front of an up-to-date functioning computer with a dual screen. And on the other hand, other students will be very, very hard pressed to access the courses on their mobile phones because their data plans aren't enough, because simply, people's financial abilities and people's all sorts of abilities that to some extent get checked at the entrance to college campus, to the extent that campus is able to lend equality, that all disappeared. There's no library to sit in, there's no campus internet to use. So students have been raising attention on this, and many teachers as well. And universities are starting to get woke, which is another reason to put a picture of a Wookiee there. And the second thing that is happening is, you remember when that BBC interview, you remember when that was the worst type of Zoom bombing that we could imagine? Well, now we cherish moments like that. And we're dealing with far different types of obstacles, such as Zoom bombing, in our own, in online transition courses. So that last piece is not conflict resolution education specific. I don't know of conflict resolution courses that have been Zoom bombed, but I do know of other schools and business schools and in law schools that are, that host negotiation courses or conflict courses. So it could happen. It could happen tomorrow. Again, just a comment that not all universities and institutions were equal with their response to that. Some depended on whether they had an online experience or not, as I said. And another, which does pertain directly to conflict education, is that there are real differences between academic programs, such as master's degrees in negotiation and conflict resolution, such as my own or Columbia's, and law schools, which handle the whole ADR side of conflict education. They're working, traditionally these institutions, most of them have very, very little online capacity up to last month. They avoided it like the plague. Oh, sorry, that is an unfortunate choice of words, or a basically true choice of words. And in addition, they are less flexible in their ability to turn ships because they have constraints. They are constrained by ABA regulations about how education has to happen. They have less flexibility to make their decisions about, such as whether courses will be graded or not. They have external influence into this, industry, law firms wanting to know which students scored in the high part of their class, and that's considered a hiring point. So things are a little different over on that side of the fence. So where are we now? Right now, I think between 2 to 4 weeks in, depending on where you're teaching. We're certainly, from every teacher I've spoken to, teaching conflict courses has told me over the past week, has told me they're feeling better. And I think that that's very important. Teachers are feeling more competent. They're feeling this isn't all going to fall apart. And they're feeling that, okay, I've managed to get on top of this. Some of the vagueness and general anxiety about the coronavirus is past. Some of the anxiety curve is flattened. And we're in a place of just help me get through this course, it'll be okay. But on the other hand, teachers are starting to realize that that understanding technology once isn't going to be enough. Like universities are starting to say, yes, Zoom, no Zoom, we're going to transition to one platform or another. Universities are starting to talk about, teachers are starting to think of, will I be teaching here in the fall? There's less job security in every field, and this is getting real in higher education as anywhere else. And generally speaking, this isn't over. This will affect courses in the summer. This will affect courses in the fall, and perhaps even beyond. So we're looking at, basically, looking ahead, we're looking at 4 periods which we can think about at this point in time if we're feeling a little better about our teaching thus far, our learning thus far. We've got the hang of this. So can we do anything better? And in thinking about, can we do anything better, we can think of, can we make any improvements for this semester? Can we make any improvements looking ahead toward the summer, looking ahead toward the fall semester? And to be honest, can we think ahead to whatever it is that comes next? And I'm sorry for being pessimistic, but this is not going to be the only situation, reason, predicament for a need for online education to hit us. And I think that, you know, God forbid we have COVID-23, but there will be something. And I think that it would be very helpful from a teacher's perspective, from an educational perspective, from a student's perspective, to start thinking ahead to how can I improve the way I do things so that I'll be better prepared if anything else hits. So the question now is, how can we put what we call online education, the field that preceded all this transitioning remote educational all of a sudden process. How can we think better about our education and do well in the online world? And I suggest, coming from the field of online education, I suggest putting your thoughts, or separating your thoughts into 4 buckets or categories. And I'll briefly touch on all of them, but very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to you, and your comments or your suggestions or your questions or your future thinking can be separated into these buckets. So the first and foremost is pedagogy. So most of what has been talked about under pedagogy so far has been, as I said, has been about making technology work in order to create facsimile courses at a distance. But essentially, teaching isn't about technology, and pedagogy isn't about technology, and it never was. And I'm going to suggest 4 conceptual shifts that you might want to put to work for you for improving transition classes. One of them is to stop looking at teacher instruction as, you know, your main task, and instead to focus on the notion of student learning. Now, I know I'm not saying that traditional face-to-face teachers don't do all of this. I'm trying to say that words and concepts and frames are really, really important in the jump from the classroom to online education. So when I think about teacher instruction, I'm thinking about my own delivery. And when I'm thinking about student learning, I'm thinking about the multiple ways in which students learn, you know, as they sit at home or wherever, as they look at a computer screen, as they engage with each other in different ways, as they read their books, as they listen or read or watch me as a teacher, as they engage with each other. So the focus on student learning rather than on instruction. The focus on, instead of focusing on preparing a course, when we prepare courses for face-to-face courses, we think about preparing ourselves and we think about preparing material. In online education, we talk about designing, and that means, that entails trying to craft the experience that the student goes through in order to provide them an optimal learning experience. And there is a difference between those 2 frames. Another step you can take is to consider that in many educational programs, teachers have a great deal of latitude inside their courses to design their classroom interactions and due dates and assessment. And I think all that is great. Online, successful online learning usually depends on a certain degree of uniformity at a program level. And that is because student confusion is your worst enemy in online learning. It's bad enough when a student can raise their hand in a classroom and say, sorry, Noam, I don't remember when this paper is due. I don't remember how we're supposed to do this assignment. In online learning, raising that hand and asking that question is simply not as simple. So any confusion, any deviation from a syllabus, or any deviation from a perceived syllabus creates student anxiety. And one of the best ways to avoid that is to have a certain degree of uniformity across a student's entire program, so that all teachers are more or less on the same page on certain basic issues. I'm not talking about full uniformity, of course, but I'm talking about on very basic issues. How much time do students get for X? If there are certain days in the week that are special, try and set a heartbeat, a rhythm to the students learning in a course, and that way they won't get confused between teachers, between courses at a distance. And finally, the shift from class hours-based learning, we're going to meet Tuesday, 1:30 to 4, and the shift to asynchronous learning. As I said, most courses that transitioned online kept to the class hours-based learning. Asynchronous learning means that within a given time period, say a few days or a week, students have to complete a certain amount of learning, a certain number of learning exercises and activities, but they do so on their own timetable. Some might do it during the day, some might do it at night, some might do it all at once, some might break it into 5 separate study hours. One way or another, the students choose within a larger framework, the students choose when they study, and they don't need, or they need less to convene with the class as an entirety at specific hours and times. So asynchronous learning happens, maybe the best way to put the difference is that class-based education happens at the same time wherever students are. And asynchronous learning happens when students are, when they prefer to do the learning, whether that's individual assignments, discussion forums, simulations. They do those either on their own timetable or at a timetable that they determine, let's say, with one other student or 3 other students in a small group, but not at a predetermined hour at which 20 or 30 or 100 students all congregate together online in a video conference. And I'll just give an example of one activity. I won't get into this whole list, but this is an example of one activity that we are used to conducting in class in real time. That moment at which the teacher says, okay, everybody break down into pairs and I'll hand out your roles, or you were assigned your roles last lesson, and now we're going to break down into breakout rooms and conduct the negotiation simulation or this mediation simulation. So here are a variety of simulation or simulation-like activities that you can conduct asynchronously, and have students do that on their own time, and either debrief them asynchronously or have a shorter class session in which you debrief it. And in that way, you're transitioning from being a fully synchronous or a more synchronous course to a less synchronous course. Just as each of these can be conducted asynchronously, they can also be debriefed asynchronously. And kind of it matches the hour. Okay, if you assign students, instead of negotiating with each other in a breakout room, you tell them go negotiate by video conference, whenever it is convenient for the 2 of you to meet this week, or by email or by text messaging, or then that's kind of really fits with our full transition of society, of us all online. That's how we're communicating. You can also break the mold of having students negotiate with each other, and you can tell them, negotiate with someone else. If you're at home with your parents, negotiate with one of them. I'll send them their role. Send you their email. I'll send you, and I'll send them their role. Negotiate with a friend. So you can break the classroom. You can break the classroom walls in a way that we generally don't. And there are other methods. I'm not going to go into each of any. If anything has piqued your curiosity, write me an email and I'll give you a couple of examples. My email will appear at the end of this. I want to move on from pedagogy to relationships. One of the toughest challenges is that teachers mention when they talk about going online, or when they resist online teaching, is I need to have real relationships with my students. And I'm not saying that relationships aren't important. Relationships are everything. But I'm suggesting that relationships aren't about technology, and they never were about technology, but technology seems to be a barrier. So I'm going to suggest that most successful online education programs that I know take relationships seriously, and good online teachers are those who have figured out how to build real relationships with their students online. Just lose the quotation marks around real, okay? If you aim high in person, you aim to build good relationships, real relationships with your students in a classroom, aim for the same online, and you'll be successful. Technology is not a barrier to this. And I'm speaking as someone who has seen many teachers make this transition from resistance to having very deep and meaningful and mentoring relationships with students. You know, you can notice your students and remember them and just do all that good relational stuff that you do in classroom. You can do that online. Your conflict skills will serve you well. And all you need in order to do it well is a new intentionality. Some things come very natural in a classroom. Some things come very natural when you bump into each other in the hallway or when a student passes your door. You need more intentionality when you're doing this online. So start thinking about ways that you can work intentionally towards relationship building. Some of this is agency transference. Ask students for their opinions about how it might be best to teach certain aspects of the course. Respect their circumstances, respect their agency, let them make choices. Ask them about their preferences. Show them that you are a person. This means some degree of personal divulging. Share your own circumstances. They are unlikely to be any odder, weirder, more unexpected than circumstances that students are in themselves right now. And think about different ways to show social presence, to make your voice and presence appear to students, to be immediate to students. You have so many tools at your hands online. Every time you give an assignment is an opportunity to share your voice. Every time you grade an assignment is an opportunity to share your voice. Every time you make a class announcement is an opportunity to share your voice. You can record a 2-minute video and drop it into class in the middle of the week between classes, and you've put a real face to that teacher and put it into students' inbox, and you've shared presence with them. And you can think of ways in which students can do that with each other, that they can be unsilent and visible with you and with others. And the final box is the community box. And this is at the program level mainly, rather than the classroom. But while this might pertain to those of you who are deans, program leaders, department heads, but even if you're an individual teacher, or even if you're a student, you can initiate these things just by either starting or speaking to the one who should be starting and saying, hey, we need this. Good online education programs focus a lot of energy on community building. The community building happens between teachers at the program level, at the school level. They foster community between students. They foster community between students and teachers. They don't assume that just because we're at a distance, everyone is living their own lives and there is no commonly shared space outside of the specific class activities. So whether it's by a newsletter, or whether it's by writing a weekly blast of updates, or whether it's by holding program competitions, holding program listening hours, in which you convene everybody via video conference and people talk, just sharing circles, updates from the director or the dean. Not everyone will show up to these, but a lot of students will show up to these, and even those who don't show up to those will be very happy that you did these things. It's showing them that their program is both ongoing, it's strong, it still exists, people are holding that space, and that they matter as community members. Teachers and students all need this. It's a chance to be seen, to be updated and receive information, and it's a chance to be heard. Think of different ways you can do this, no matter what your role is. And finally, I want to leave you with the thought that this is a crisis, to be sure, and we all went into crisis mode and turned the big ship of higher education on a dime like it was a jet ski. But essentially, this is also an opportunity. And in the conflict world, we often we like to talk about the Chinese symbol for crisis and opportunity being the same symbol, and what Homer Simpson calls a crisiternity. And I think this is a crisiternity. And if we adopt the crisis-eternity perspective as educators and as students, I think we can make great advances. One specific perspective that I'd like to offer you as you think about the future of your work in this is that we often say, well, how can I do this in a way that will either be nearly as good as online classroom teaching, or really rise to the level of I'm teaching online and the teaching and the learning is as good as it is in the classroom. And I'd like to suggest that that's setting the bar really low. Well, not really low, but it's setting the bar low. And instead, you might ask yourself, well, I'm given this opportunity. Why don't I start thinking about, are there ways in which I can use the online environment, the technology at my disposal, my students, other resources, in order to teach online even better than I do in class? As a student, in order to learn online even better than I learn in class. And I know this might seem an impossible or unlikely bar for some, but there's the challenge, and no, no reason not to try. There is no, just to kind of cheat here and give the bottom line. The bottom line of a decade of research has shown that there's no, that online education can be as good in terms of learning outcomes and in terms of student experience as face-to-face education. Now, it's doubtful and it's understandable that this kind of quick setup remote learning will not be as good as our classrooms. But the bar of online learning can be good, and in some studies can be better than classroom education, is something that we can all think about in thinking, how do we approach our teaching during this period? And finally, and I'll say on that, I'll say that this is a chance to rethink your educational approach from the bottom up. How often do you get to tear down everything you do as a teacher and figure it out anew in order to meet a new environment of teaching? And I'll suggest that as you do that, the insights that you'll gain about, is this a good activity for online teaching? Is this really a good activity at all? What were my assumptions in doing it in the classroom? And therefore, will those translate online? Maybe there's a better way to do it online. Hey, maybe that better way to do it online would actually work in a classroom and be better than this holds the potential not only to be a better online teacher tomorrow than you are today, it also offers you the opportunity to be a better classroom teacher. That's how wonderful I see this aspect of the crisis eternity. And of course, the last thing is zooming out of this and remembering that while we were transitioning online, so what was most on our mind was making sure that we could somehow reasonably teach everything that was on the syllabus and everything that we had planned, or as much as possible, that we can still reasonably teach it remotely. But we also have a larger role as educators, and zooming out of the syllabus, I'm sure that all of you have had situations in which you've brought what is going on into your classroom, either as examples of conflict examples, or as revelations about people and how they act in relationship to one another, how they change and how they grow. And everything that is going on around us, I think, offers both a wealth of insight and also a wealth of unavoidable experiential learning. And I think that if we can somehow figure out how to capture this as we go about our conflict teaching, then we will rise above what we were yesterday and provide students with an overall better conflict education. And I wish that to all of us. And the last thing, the last line, well, first I want to contribute something. Anybody transitioning online and considering how to transition, how to improve that transition, here are some resources that I have. My YouTube channel, there are a lot of online lectures, short and long, on negotiation and mediation and other conflict topics. You're free to use them if they help you in any way. These are lectures by me and also by other colleagues in the conflict world. On my SSRN page, you can Google it. You'll find both simulations that were designed to be used in to have students negotiating online. You might want to try some of those out instead of simulations that kind of assume and pretend that participants are in the same room. You'll find a couple of articles on transitioning classes online, on conducting simulations online, and finally, if you want to utilize the forum in order to teach a new fuss, then there are articles there on negotiating online and conflict resolution online. And this is the bottom line of it. It's easy to get lost in the technology. It's easy to get lost in the new environment. But essentially, you already have everything you need. And that's true. This is as true for students as it is for teachers. Sure, the environment is different. And sure, the technology throws us for a while. We're getting better at both. And now we can focus on what we do best, which is teaching and learning. Thank you, everybody. I look forward to your questions and to your answers and suggestions. And back over to you and over to Beth.
Hi, Noam. Thanks so much for all that rich information. And we will get to the questions. Just one comment I wanted to make is that what we do need to keep in mind is that, as you mentioned, there are so many other things going on in our lives right now that as teachers and as learners, and that could be the same person, right? That we are also, all of this is being compounded by all the other stresses in life. So it's not as though we're just in a very calm state all the time and just saying, wow, let me just really embrace this online learning. There's other stuff going on. So let's look at some of the questions here. We're planning a 40-hour divorce mediation training live via Zoom. What design issues should we be aware of? So Noam, did you want to think about that?
I'll jump in if you want to answer, Beth. Feel free to join. But well, first one is: has anyone there ever taught via Zoom? Or what is your degree of your degree of efficacy with Zoom? And just for that, all I'd suggest is practice, practice, practice. Hold a lot of conversations with friends and colleagues on Zoom, just so you're a natural with technology. The design considerations is, I think, first of all, as Beth said earlier, it might be that the 9 to 4 format, whatever your plan might be, the full day, particularly if it's one full day after another, that format might not work as well via Zoom as it does in a classroom. In a classroom, you have so many things that break, that move students around, breaks up the time. You know, before attention starts wandering, they're getting up and taking a break or walking into another room and sitting down with other people. And online, video-based, Zoom-based learning, there is something more monolithic about it. So I would consider how you break up those hours matters. A second thing is to discuss certainly the issue of, since I'm guessing that half of that time you had intended to have simulations, which is usually the breakdown, give thought to how you conduct those simulations. So if together with Sharon Press, I gave a webinar on how to conduct negotiation and mediation simulations via Zoom. That's on my YouTube channel. You can look at that. There's a paper on my SRN channel page. One thing you might consider including, as long as you're online, is you might consider a topic of online mediation. What is different between the online venue and our conference room, and how to utilize that best, both in our training, but also in our practice. I'll be happy to answer anything more specific, but those are the two big things that stand out. Beth, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, and that is that for me, I always go back to what the basic learning goals are of any workshop or training program or course. So in the 40-hour divorce mediation, what are the learning goals? What are the outcomes you want people to have? And then I look back at adult learning principles. So what is it that enhances the ability for adults to learn? And that would be not only now in a face-to-face, but then in online. I would imagine that there are certain guidelines and protocol that people need to become familiar with. There are certain skill sets and the ways of communicating that they need to become familiar with. And so some of those you can just simulate in online options as well. So I just would always go back to what the learning outcomes are for each of the training sessions. Okay, we have another one here, and this is, I'm curious why you opted to do the presentation slides only without you being on video. Do you feel that does or does not impact presentation? I'm just going to answer initially to this one, then Noam, please feel free to jump in. But this is part of our webinar series, and webinar format is mostly that there are just slides and that there aren't videos, but I know sometimes we do have that as well. It's just the way the program has been doing the webinars for years now. But Noam, do you want to add something in there?
Yeah, and I'll answer that by flipping that towards the question of how should we be thinking about this during teaching? And the answer is, first of all, we should think about that. And I'm very glad that you asked that. That's exactly the type. Just like everything makes a difference in our face-to-face classrooms, this makes a difference online. So I opted to do it that way because Beth told me that's the format, and that's fine. When you add in your own video, you, on the one hand, you're taking more bandwidth, so far as I know. Even though we are screencasting here, I think that video itself takes more bandwidth, and that's a consideration, both depending on perhaps the amount of people you have on the call, but also sometimes you have to think of students on the other line and what is their bandwidth availability. That some of them are, again, as we said, on mobile devices and on data plans. So that's one thing to consider. All things being equal, of course, I do prefer to have video either as a small box in the corner or side by side or however it can be done. Because I think that it's more interesting to be spoken to by a face than a voice. You get more sense of the person, and all in all, there's more social presence. I think is the important term which we need to come back to. Social presence does a lot in terms of giving participants, learners, or students a sense for who their teacher is. It's for building rapport between students and teachers. It's for building students' trust in teachers. And I always find that important. So I'd suggest that if you are able to, technologically speaking, and if you think it won't disadvantage anyone on the other side, I'd consider it favorably.
Yeah, I was going to add also, so this is a webinar format, right? So that's why we choose to do it this way, as compared to a synchronous learning session. When we have our synchronous classes, then there is an expectation and actually a requirement that everybody does use their video and that everybody is visible, so that you do have a different kind of interaction than you have here. So in the webinar format, it really is more of a presentation mode where there really is an imparting of information. So it's not as interactive as a synchronous online session, which we hold, which are expected to be interactive as well, including even, say, breakout rooms, where then there's even a higher level of interactivity. Another thing I was going to mention too about online learning is that as an instructor, one of the things I find that is better in an online environment, especially when you record things, we've had assignments in the past where we've recorded role plays and mediations of negotiation, mediations, and so on. And as an instructor, it gives you an opportunity to observe an entire mediation or an entire negotiation so that you can give feedback on the whole dynamic, rather than only if you're in a classroom and you're just sort of jumping around from negotiation to negotiation. Role play, you don't have a chance to see the entire one unless it's more of a fishbowl. So for the student who sometimes questions, well, am I really getting the value in an online environment that I would as face-to-face? I would say in some ways you're getting more, because you're able to get feedback on the entire part of your role play rather than just on a portion, because of the limitations of what an instructor can do in a fixed amount of time, rather than expanding that time, because now we have more hours to view the collection of videos.
Beth, if I can I quickly just weigh in on that and say that I'm so glad you raised that, to burst the bubble the fallacy of, how much of negotiations or mediations we actually see as teachers. Essentially, the truth is that we see 4 or 5 minutes of any student's negotiation in a simulation. We don't see the whole thing. And I think it's really important to recognize that, because often teachers say, you can't teach online because then I won't be able to see their simulations. And yeah, but we don't really have the opportunity to observe everything in class as well. But on the other side, I also want to comment that while this makes it much easier to view larger portions of student simulations, I want to be very careful. I'm not, far be it from me to dismiss anything you said, but just I suggest, I don't think that you wanted to set an expectation that teachers will now or should now view all of students' simulations start to finish. The time involved in doing that would be very, very heavy, and I don't think I don't think we want to set that as a norm, particularly when we're thinking about adjuncts. In certain institutions, adjuncts who would be tasked to that or feel that that was the norm would wind up being paid 3 cents an hour. So I want to be a little careful. That's sorry.
Thank you for that. Absolutely not setting that expectation. And I'd be the first one to say that. I think what would be interesting too is that you just take a chunk, you just take part of it.
Right.
And then the other thing that it gives the student also an opportunity to engage more in even how they get feedback. So students can say, I really would like you to pay attention to this part of the role play or something like that, because maybe they want feedback on, I tried this technique, how did it work? Instead of just saying, give me generic feedback on the whole thing. So there's an opportunity for more partnership in how the learning takes place so that students and faculty can work together on that feedback loop. No, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to say that I think in that sense, there are more ways to mine these online simulations for feedback than there are classroom simulations for feedback. And I suggest, again, there's on my YouTube channel, there's a webinar that I gave for the ABA on conducting online simulations, in which we discussed, Sharon Press and I, we discussed quite a variety of ways to conduct debrief sessions or to mine simulations for information. And certainly students it can be student focused or student initiated, or you can send students looking through the simulation for particular things. You can tell them to choose the most important or meaningful chunk and ask for your feedback or ask targeted questions. There's just so much to do.
Absolutely. So we are coming towards the end of our session together, and I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you so much, Noam, for all your great words of wisdom and sharing your experience with us. What would you like to say in closing?
I'm just grateful for everybody who came and cleared the time and attention. Again, as I said at the beginning, I know how different that is now than it often is. I think this is a very important topic, and that teachers are working so hard. As you said, Beth, not everybody is able to clear the attention. I didn't mean to give the impression like, oh, we have this time, we can consider all these new pedagogical changes. No, I really think that it's quite the opposite. It's so hard. I spend, 6 hours nowadays to try and do an hour's work. And that's why I appreciate even more everybody who showed up and is going to think about some of these things moving on. So beyond that, Beth, thank you so much for providing us all this opportunity. And I hope some really good ideas flow from it. And I hope that as good ideas flow from it, I hope that you'll share it with Beth, with myself, with your colleagues, whether you're a student or a teacher and you have a good idea for making this better, share it. We're all learning nowadays. Be a part of that. So just thank you. And thank you, Dom, for making sure this all went so smoothly. Take care, everyone.
Of course. And thank you. Certainly giving you a virtual round of applause for this really engaging presentation. And as I'm going to echo Beth in saying thank you to all the attendees for joining today and for making the time. Noam, I'm wondering, you referenced your YouTube channel and other ways to contribute to the conversation. Do you have any available contact information, or would you rather that anybody for today's session reach out to me directly to share that?
Oh, my contact information, it appears on that last slide, but it might, sorry. There it is. So this is where the resources are, and my email is noamebner@creighton.edu. And just to find those resources online, just Google my name, and basically Google's your best friend here. So Noam Ebner YouTube will bring you to my channel. Noam Ebner SSRN will bring you to that page where all the articles and simulations are, or you can do Noam Ebner negotiation, Noam Ebner mediation, and you'll come to these things.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Noam. I'll keep the presentation open for another 2 or 3 minutes so everyone has some opportunities to jot all this down. But for the most part, thank you to everyone. We will be sending on over the recording to the session to all those that have registered today, so you will have this also as additional resource to you as well. Thanks again. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and thanks for joining us today.